Any listener over the age of 45, a conventional doc is really looking at one thing. I hate to sound so reductionistic, but they're really fixated on the cholesterol levels.
Welcome to the Wise Traditions Podcast, sponsored by the Weston A. Price Foundation for Wise Traditions in Food, Farming, and the Healing Arts. We are your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health.
I'm your host, Hilda Labrada Gore. This is episode 91, and my guest is Dr. Richard Maurer. Richard is a licensed naturopathic doctor and the author of The Blood Code. Sometimes trying new diets or eliminating certain foods or adding supplements just feels like guesswork, like we're trying to figure out what our bodies need without knowing for sure what's working. In today's discussion, Richard gives us straight talk about the most objective way to evaluate our health, blood work. He explains which tests are key to understanding our metabolism, and he also talks about how we can boost our overall health and how you can find your sweet spot using this tool. Before we dive into the conversation, we want to make note of two things. The Wise Traditions Conference is coming up November 10th to the 13th in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We are so stoked. It is a phenomenal event. Tons of speakers will be there covering a wide range of topics. The food is incredible and, of course, Wise Traditions friendly. Best of all, it is more affordable than ever. Take your health to new heights and go to wisetraditions.org and register today. Hey, and we just want to give you all a shout out. Thank you for listening to the show. We could not pull it off without your support, both emotional and financial, on the regular, so thank you. Welcome to Wise Traditions, Richard.
Hilda, it's a pleasure to be on the show. Thank you.
People nowadays try diet after diet after diet as they try to find their sweet spot. Has that been true in your experience with the patients that you see?
There is not a patient I've seen that hasn't changed their diet at least 5 times in the years or decade prior to seeing me, which I'm all for. We're our best test subject, but with a little bit of science. My interest is making sure that when we make a change, we're pivoting off of some data point or we're pivoting off of some metric that actually is likely to be right for us. So what are, my question with the diets I've approached and how I'm living my life, I try to keep this evidence-based changes. And yes, I'm on that low-carb, high-fat end of the spectrum myself for various reasons. And I have spoken at and am sitting in front of my new Wise Traditions magazine. And I've been a part of the Weston Price Foundation for 20 years now. But I'm always looking for a better metric to measure for myself to make sure I'm going on the right path. And that's what I do with my patients. And it's so helpful to give them a reason why they should do something rather than stand there on a soapbox and say, this is inherently so good to do, whether it's raw milk or whether it's gluten-free, dairy-free, or whether it seems like people are chasing what they want to believe in rather than what's working for them.
And or what their friends are doing, right? If someone's like, I found this and it's really working for me, then they'll adopt it into their diet without a second thought.
I have seen several teenagers of my own grow up, and peer pressure plays a huge role. And we don't acknowledge it much as adults. I think at 50, I'm not vulnerable to what my friends are doing. But, people are throughout their lives. You're right.
So, Richard, how do we pivot on the right metric? How do we find out if we're going down the right path for ourselves or not?
I'll warn the listeners that I am biased. I use blood tests. Anyone who Googles my name or has read the blood code will see. I really think blood tests are a useful metric for the vast majority of us to better understand what we're doing and what the impact is for us. So there are some other things, of course. Someone can do skin fold calipers and look at how it's affecting their fitness level or their leanness. But myself, I've found things like my energy level. It's not such a great metric. So I like looking for those objective metrics like blood test results.
Hold on. So you're saying if I'm feeling super energetic, that's still not telling me that I'm healthy?
Oh, I have so many people that they mistake good energy with stimulant effects.
Hmm.
Right. So, energy is always preceded with a word like increased, or, I can't tell you, I have a godson who is just finished at a very nice high school somewhere. And I asked him once, the stimulant medication to help for performance is more and more common for kids to get through school and be performing well on tests. And I asked him, how many if you just grabbed 10 random classmates from your high school, how many are on some stimulant medication? And I was waiting for 3 out of 10. And he said, about 8.
Wow.
And everyone in the room, including my, at that time, 2 high school students, look over and said, what? And he paused and he hedged it and said, no, that's not right. And he thinks about it, and you can tell he's calculating his friends and people around him, and he goes, more like 7. And I think we're seeing a generation of people that don't have a good relationship with what healthy energy is.
Mm-hmm.
To then use a metric of, okay, I perform better on tests if I eat like this, or if I take this herb or medication. I'm hesitant. I'm not going to trust that. I know what that's like for me, but maybe I'm a little more experienced and I have other metrics that I've run on myself. And I'll add that I may be a little bit older, but I think, using energy is a tricky one.
So earlier you said, I have to admit I'm biased, but what I like about you, Richard, is that you're biased toward objectivity. You want us to have a clear understanding of what our body needs, not just by what we think or may perceive, right? So you really think that the blood is the best indicator for how our body is functioning.
That's right. And of course, someone listening to this show is probably thinking, what am I talking about by blood tests? I'll add right off, I'm not talking about genetic testing. Which really only leads us towards a propensity or a vulnerability. And many times that vulnerability only increases the level of expression by 10%, 8%. So while these genetic tests are very, very interesting for various things, certain cancers, or there's even a gene that might be linked to a certain subtype of dementia, these only represent a tiny fraction of a percent of the people actually developing that condition. So I'm more interested in the functional blood tests, the very basic metabolic blood tests, like someone's triglyceride HDL and someone's insulin level and their glucose. Some tests as simple as those can help me understand what's happening, what's storing, what's burning. Is there excessive carb or excess calorie going in, and what's the body doing with it?
So it's not like I can just go to the doctor, get some blood tests, and expect that those will give me necessarily the results I want. You're talking about something that sounds like my regular doctor wouldn't be looking at.
Usually not. Any listener over the age of 45, a conventional doc is really looking at one thing. I hate to sound so reductionistic, but they're really fixated on the cholesterol levels. There's just a excessive weight put on LDL cholesterol. And then they're looking for whether there is an overt problem. We're also vulnerable now to, in the medical world, to what's called reflex reimbursement testing. So a doctor can't code for a certain blood test like ferritin unless someone is already anemic. So if someone's CBC looks good, the doc is never going to order a ferritin level routinely.
So how do we get the right blood tests, and then how do we get them evaluated?
It's, and none of these tests are very expensive. So sometimes it's a conversation with a doctor to say, please order these tests. I want my ferritin and my B12 run this time. And can you please run my insulin along with my blood sugar and lipid? There's also simple ways where these can be done directly, where you can go to a prepaid online lab provider. I link to those on my blood code website. The footer of every page links to one that is extremely effective for people around the country, and especially in the Northeast where I am. It's called ULTA lab tests, ULTA. The labs are all done at Quest, but this online platform allows you to pay, get a remarkably discounted price, and a common progress panel that I order is around $94. And that's linked at the bottom of the blood code, but it's called the metabolic progress panel. Discovery panel I use when I'm seeing someone first has the B12, ferritin, vitamin D added to all the insulin and glucose numbers. And it's around $174. So I was shooting to have them design a panel that was under $100 just because there are enough panels out there that are $800, $1,000, really comprehensive, but more information doesn't necessarily give us more solutions.
Well, I will definitely put a link to your website in our show notes so people can look into that. And I really do like how pragmatic and objective this approach is with getting our blood evaluated, because as you and I know, we have both been at conferences where people are grabbing the latest supplements and it's like a trend and almost that peer pressure you were talking about, but on a marketing level that makes you think, oh, that person is saying this is good, I guess I'll try it. And people have no clue if that's going to benefit them or not.
You're absolutely right. And I think we were both just recently together at the Paleo Conference. And that's one of those diet and lifestyles that people are adopting often with their eyes closed. I've been speaking there for many years. If I just take myself personally, I'm from a family full of type 2 diabetics. So by the time I was in my even early 40s, I was insulin resistant. So for me to follow a very challenging, metabolically stimulating exercise routine along with a low-carb, high-fat diet, it works brilliantly for me. But if I have someone who hasn't inherited the type 2 traits and they have a little hypothyroid and they're a woman, not a man, to get their carb level below 40 grams often makes them crash and burn. They feel awful. They may feel good for the first month or 3 months or even 6 months, but their health will suffer in the long run. And I see that very often.
Yes. Weren't you telling me about a Division I athlete? I believe it was a woman who was trying to eat this low carb, high fat way. What happened to her?
That's right. She's her exercise routine can't be improved upon. It's at the maximum of that any of us would expect of ourselves. But a diet that her father has found works very well for him, he thought, this is great, this will work well for her. While she felt better initially, she became pretty compromised afterwards. And by that, I mean her performance started dropping off. Her weight, her body fat actually started going up. And interestingly, her thyroid actually reduced. And this is something we know very well about athletes. If they're not fully recovering, or if they're overheating with their athletic demands, or if they're undernourishing by not eating enough, their T3 levels will crash. It'll look like functional hypothyroidism, where their T3 levels are down at 2 or less, if people know what free T3 levels are. So some of I'll mention blood test results every now and then on the show here, but basically just a below normal free T3 level. And it means her body's just trying to preserve capital, and it's shutting down that thyroid metabolism to help her not burn as many calories.
Oh.
The problem is that doesn't feel good, nor does it help her performance.
It reminds me, someone was saying that a whole basketball team tried to do this. Did you hear about this? Was it the Los Angeles Lakers, it might have been, that they all went low carb, high fat across the board? And again, this goes against your suggestion that we kind of look at what each body needs, and they're just trying to blanket follow this diet. And I believe they had a poor performing season or two when they went that direction.
No surprise. While it was, if we just take the numbers of insulin resistance, I think that very low carb, high fat diet, it works great for those people with insulin resistance. And if you take over 20-year-olds, so the adult population in the US, it represents about 40 to 44% of the population. In China, it's around 50%. In Mexico, it's around 60%. So we're around 44%, which means, over half the people don't need to go in this low carb, high fat direction. and will probably get worse if they maintain it for long. That 40% of us thrive in it. So the problem is when we get on a podium and start talking about how great we feel, it's very compelling to everyone.
Of course. Are you implying, Richard, that even a wonderful diet like the Wise Traditions diet might not be just the right fit for every single person?
Well, I'm not going to, by saying the Wise Traditions diet, we're including so many wonderful things that I can actually say are probably beneficial for everybody. So we cherry pick, right? My mother was type 2 diabetes at 60. By the time I was 42 to 43, I was pretty substantially pre-diabetic. My hemoglobin A1C was 6%. My blood sugars were drifting up to the low hundreds. And anyone who would look at me would know it was not because of being overweight. I have that type 2 trait. I was eating this wonderful sourdough bread that a baker up the road makes. He cracks the grains into the sourdough, leaves it there for 48 hours, slow cooks it. It's a beautiful bread. And I would have that with my raw milk butter. But clearly, 2 pieces of bread each morning was too much. I had to drop the sourdough bread, regardless of how good the bread is. And I know lactic bread and the lactic brown breads, they're lower in their carbohydrate effect, but only lower by about 15 to 20%. So still, the best bread is still a carbohydrate load that my type 2 trait, by the time I was in my 40s, was too much. So I had to make modifications.
And I think that's what we at the foundation expect people to do. We give out these principles and these guidelines that are for health in general for most people. But if someone has a lactose sensitivity, for example, we're not expecting them to still have raw milk because a lot of traditional people's had raw milk. We expect people to make the best decisions for them. Coming up, Richard gets into the controversial topic of cholesterol. We pause now to remind you about 2 things. One is our upcoming Wise Traditions Conference in Minneapolis, Minnesota, November 10th to the 13th. A while ago, we asked a few of you, what is a barrier to your attending? And a lot of you said money. So we hear you. We've come up with a lot of options to make it affordable. There is a no meals price plan, so if you want to just bring your own food, do it. There's a weekend-only price plan, and even a one-day pass for those who live within driving distance of Minneapolis. There is bound to be something that will work for your budget, so check it out at wisetraditions.org. Register today and take your health to new heights. Hey, and please remember that we appreciate your listening. Your support is invaluable. Today, we want to thank C.S. Burney for what he had to say on his Apple Podcast review. He said, I will never feel guilty for eating bacon again. Every time I listen to one of Hilda's interviews, I learn something, usually something all of us really ought to know about our health and our eating. Cheers to the Weston A. Price Foundation and to host Hilda Labrada Gore. Thank you so much, C.S. Burney. Keep listening and sharing the show with your friends. And to all of you, do just as he did. Rate and review us on iTunes. It helps increase our visibility to everyone searching for new shows to listen to. But let's back up a minute. You mentioned cholesterol earlier as a big concern in the medical community. What do you say to the person who is eating well, probably maybe even in keeping with the Wise Traditions diet, who has high cholesterol?
Well, it's a great question. And I have to define what to me is high cholesterol. So for me, for a woman, it's a total cholesterol of greater than 320. And for a man, it's a total cholesterol of greater than 280, 290. Obviously, if someone's going to be in those upper reaches of cholesterol, I expect their HDL to be a significant portion of them. And I want to see their triglyceride level at or below the HDL level. So if someone has an HDL of 80 milligrams per deciliter, I'm using US numbers, the standard numbers, then I want their triglyceride to be 80 or 70 milligrams per deciliter. So the cholesterol levels, we mentioned last time we were together, we mentioned a patient that had recently written me, and he had looked at his new cholesterol levels because he had this great resource for raw milk, he was doing an increased amount of raw milk, probably 2, maybe even 3 servings a day. But his cholesterol level went up above 350.
Wow.
So I explained to him that I'm not comfortable with that. And I've seen over and over again, even small amounts of dairy, when they're removed in certain people, cholesterol levels drop. He was so surprised because at that time he didn't think he was doing too much dairy, but when he cut it out, his cholesterol level dropped to about 240.
Now, the numbers you mentioned that are your standards seem higher than what the doctors consider high cholesterol. Is that right? In other words, your standard is it can be higher than the conventional medical community believes.
They are much higher. I'm not looking at a total cholesterol, even straight LDL. For people that have not had a heart attack, primary prevention is not well addressed. Primary prevention means preventing a heart attack or stroke that hasn't happened, that someone hasn't experienced yet. It's not well addressed by using cholesterol as a metric. And boy, anyone in our Wise Traditions community, whether we're listening to our friends and colleague, Tom Cowan or Stephanie Seneff, the same message will be reiterated over and over.
Absolutely. I think I told you my story that I went into my doctor's office. She was shocked, when she just saw how healthy I was. I think she sees people who are struggling most of the time. Obviously, doctors see people who are sick. But she asked me all these questions, again, was jaw-droppingly astounded by the peak of health I was in. And then she said, you know what, though? Your cholesterol is a little high. And she gave me a handout that was explaining how I needed to eat low fat. And I was just so shocked. I was thinking, gosh, can't she see what's right in front of her? But they've been told to guide the patients a certain way, and that's just what they do, right?
It's just the way it is. And can we ask, what was the cholesterol level?
I'm thinking it was around 220.
240.
Yep, 220. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which, obviously I'm using 320. I'm in a different ballpark. I'm playing a different game. But the evidence doesn't really support addressing those low levels. The evidence doesn't support it one iota, especially in women.
Mm-hmm.
Triglyceride HDL is what I focus on in the blood code, writing the book and looking in my practice. I want to see that triglyceride HDL be as close to 1-to-1 or less as possible.
Right.
So, when someone has a 220 cholesterol total and their HDL is 70 of them and their triglyceride is 60, I couldn't be happier.
Wow,
the numbers look great.
Interesting. So let's go back as we start to wrap up now.
Yeah.
If I were a listener who was just like, okay, this is really intriguing me because I know I'm only guessing, it's kind of guessing at what's going to work best for my body, and I really want to take the next step, what would you suggest that they do?
Ultimately, I'd look at, let's distill this. There would be 2 blood tests I'd have people check.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be on the next blood draw. Usually there's a comprehensive metabolic panel, and that'll have blood sugar, and you get that fasting. And usually there'll be a lipid panel. And I'd want people to focus on what that triglyceride HDL is.
Mm.
And the other test that no doc will ever order on their own is a serum insulin. Knowing your fasting serum insulin along with the glucose tells us whether that anabolic hormone is too high or too low or right where it should be. And the reference range for the lab, what's printed on the lab sheet, will be an excessively wide reference range. I like to see between 3 and 8.
Mm-hmm.
It'll sometimes be lower than 3 in people on a very low carb diet, but typically 3 to 8 is the sweet spot. That means your body is still building muscle effectively, but not storing excessive fat. Simple tests. And that's where we have to, I'll touch on 2 things. One is if the triglyceride is much higher than the HDL, carbs need to be reduced. And if insulin is above 10, it's outside of that 3 to 8 range. Those are people I'm recommending far less dairy in their diet.
Okay.
Because dairy protein and dairy sugar are both the most insulinemic of all foods, gram for gram. Lactalbumin and dairy globulins have a huge insulin effect on our human bodies.
Well, Richard, you've given us a lot of food for thought, no food pun intended. And I want to ask you...
But it's always effective.
I know, right? So this is great. I'm going to put links for the recommendations you gave us in the show notes. Well, definitely for your website and for your book, The Blood Code. And I like that you've given us 2 tests in particular that we can kind of start out on our journey with, because we need to know where to begin to evaluate objectively the state of our health and our bodies. So I often ask at the end of my show a question that you may have answered, but you might have a different answer. And the question is, if the listener could only do one thing to improve their health, what would you recommend that they do?
I would lean towards an exercise. I would have people every day do something at least for 3 to 5 minutes. I'd have them do something that's more challenging, that's harder than their day would normally entail.
I like that. I like that a lot. And what will that do for us?
Oh, it does everything for us, right? It improves our energy. It improves our posture. If we can maintain a better form and function and posture, we will look younger and be younger throughout our lives. It also changes our brain patterns. If we just do something challenging and get through it, the small stuff is less. I think when people hit that exercise point, they're managing conflict and they're managing stress in a far, far more effective way in their lives.
Well, that is very valuable advice. I'm so glad you gave it to us. I'm going to keep it up. I've been exercising a lot over these years, but I'm going to keep it up and make sure to do something every day. You know, sometimes I just work out every other day, but now I'm going to really apply your advice and make sure I keep moving in some challenging way every day to stay young and strong. So thank you again for your time, Richard. It's been a wonderful conversation.
Once again, Hilda, it is really a pleasure to be here, and thank you.
My guest today was Dr. Richard Maurer. Listen more about his work and recommendations at his website, thebloodcode.com. For highlights from today's show, including links to the lab test company that he recommended, please go to the westonaprice.org website and click on the show notes for episode 91. Hey, and a big thank you to Podcast Village for your support of the program. Sarah Fernandez, Georgia Michaels, and all the rest, you are the best. Check them out at podcastvillage.com and find out how they can help you launch your own show. Lastly, let me just tell you that one of the joys I find in being a podcast host is meeting you. I will be in Minneapolis, Minnesota at the conference in November, and I hope you will be too. Sally is going to do a one-day cooking class. Chris Masterjohn will be there throwing down some amazing information, and there'll be familiar and new faces all around. So come on out. It's going to be awesome. I hope to meet you in November.
Thanks for listening today. Our website, westonaprice.org, offers free resources to address your questions and support your journey to health. You'll find videos, articles, and brochures covering a broad variety of health topics. Wise Traditions is brought to you by the Weston A. Price Foundation for Wise Traditions in Food, Farming, and the Healing Arts. The content of this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for medical advice.